Join me as I dive deep into the life of King Saul and try to figure out what really happened to God's rejected chosen one. King Saul, the first king of Israel, chosen by God himself, and yet, later rejected by him too. This is a story of triumph and tragedy, of obedience and disobedience, of the human struggle to remain faithful to God's will. Saul's life was not without its challenges. From the very beginning, he faced opposition from the Philistines and other neighboring nations. Despite his initial successes, including the defeat of the Ammonites and the Philistines, Saul's heart began to change. He became increasingly disobedient to God's commands, seeking to ensure his own success rather than trusting in God's providence. As time went on, Saul's disobedience only grew. He failed to completely destroy the Amalekites, as God had commanded, and instead chose to spare Agag, their king, and the best of their livestock. This was a pivotal moment in Saul's reign, as it marked a clear turning point in his relationship with God. Despite the warnings from the prophet Samuel, Saul continued down a path of disobedience. He became obsessed with his own power and legacy, and this led him to make decisions that were contrary to God's will. In the early days of Saul's reign, God anointed him as king, sending a spirit of power and strength upon him. Saul led the Israelites to several victories, and for a time, it seemed as though he was the perfect choice for king. But as his disobedience grew, God's presence began to fade from his life. One of the most pivotal moments in Saul's reign was the battle against the Philistines, during which he disobeyed God's command not to eat until the evening. Saul's impatience and lack of trust in God's provision led him to offer a sacrifice, rather than waiting for Samuel to arrive. Saul's mistakes continued to pile up, including his attempt to use the witch of Endor to consult with the spirit of Samuel. This was a desperate and foolish decision, and it marked the beginning of the end of Saul's reign. But the moment that changed everything was when God told Samuel that he had rejected Saul as king. This was a devastating blow, not just to Saul, but to the entire nation of Israel. It marked a turning point, not just in Saul's life, but in the history of Israel itself. God's rejection of Saul was not just a punishment, but a lesson to the entire nation. It showed them that obedience to God's commands was not optional, but essential. It reminded them that God's ways are not their ways, and that his plans are not their plans. As we reflect on the story of King Saul, we are reminded of the importance of obedience to God's will. We are reminded that God's ways are not our ways, and that his plans are not our plans. We are reminded that when we turn away from God, we invite chaos and destruction into our lives. King Saul, the first king of Israel, chosen by God, but later rejected. It's a story that raises so many questions. What went wrong? Why did God choose him in the first place? And what can we learn from his rise and fall? Today, we're going to take a closer look at the life of King Saul and explore the reasons behind his downfall. When Saul first became king, things looked promising. He was tall, handsome, and charismatic, and the people of Israel loved him. He started out strong, winning battles and unifying the nation. But as time went on, Saul began to struggle with his own insecurities and fears. He became jealous of David, the young warrior who was gaining popularity, and he started to make decisions based on his own pride rather than seeking God's guidance. As Saul's disobedience grew, so did God's displeasure. He stopped listening to God's voice, and instead, relied on his own wisdom. He made sacrifices without following the proper protocol, and he even disobeyed God's command to wipe out the Amalekites completely. These small acts of disobedience might seem insignificant, but they added up, and eventually, God had had enough. Saul's biggest mistake was when he failed to obey God's command to destroy the Amalekites and their livestock. He claimed he was going to sacrifice the best animals to God, but in reality, he was trying to justify his own actions. This was the final straw for God, and he rejected Saul as king. It's a powerful reminder that obedience is not just about following the rules, but about trusting and surrendering to God's will. Let's take a closer look at some of the key moments in Saul's reign. When he was first anointed as king, he was given a new heart and the Spirit of God came upon him. He prophesied with the prophets, and the people of Israel saw him as a true leader. He won a major battle against the Philistines, and it seemed like he was invincible. But as time went on, his successes went to his head, and he started to rely more on his own strength than on God's power. One of the most poignant moments in Saul's story is when the prophet Samuel confronts him about his disobedience. Saul tries to justify himself, but Samuel is unsympathetic. He tells Saul that God has rejected him as king, and that he has chosen another to take his place. It's a devastating blow to Saul, and it marks the beginning of the end of his reign. But Saul's rejection wasn't just about him. It was also about God's plan for Israel. God had chosen Saul to be a king, but Saul had failed to fulfill that role. God needed a new king, one who would be obedient and faithful, and that's where David comes in. David, the young shepherd boy, would go on to become one of the greatest kings in Israel's history. The day of reckoning finally came when God told Samuel that he had rejected Saul as king. It was a critical moment, one that marked a turning point in Saul's life. From that day on, Saul's kingdom began to crumble, and David's star began to rise. It's a powerful reminder that God is sovereign, and he will not tolerate disobedience or pride. In the end, Saul's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and disobedience. It's a reminder that God requires obedience, not just lip service. Saul's rejection is a wake-up call for all of us to examine our own hearts and to make sure we're submitting to God's will. So, what did you think about King Saul's story? Did you learn anything new? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to check out our other videos on biblical stories and lessons. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.